Hi, my name is Addison Fletcher, and I'm going to be talking about Cork infills compared to alternative infills based on mechanical and functional properties in order to reduce ecological harm and impact. So just to go over a brief outline, this is what it looks like. We're going to start by talking about motivation. So the main motivation behind this proposal is that the majority of turf fields use rubber pellets, and rubber turf pellets are not ecologically friendly. They are not biodegradable, and a driving factor in increased injury rates on turf fields. So the majority of turf pellets, rubber pellets, are made from car tires, uh, which are not biodegradable. And if you've ever played on a turf field, you know that these pellets get everywhere. You play, you walk off the field, you go home, you take your shoes off, and a bunch of pellets dump out, and they will never go away. So you can imagine how turf pellets getting into the woods, just into nature around the fields, is not ideal, because they'll just never degrade. So the idea is that cork pellets offer an ecological benefit because they're made from cork wood, so they will biodegrade. Another motivating factor behind this is that uh, turf fields just in general have shown an increased rate injury rate compared to grass. So over time they've gotten a little bit better, but that's just another issue. To look at the background, it's kind of just a general overview of what um, the turf uh, evolution has looked like. So first generation turf came out a long time ago, like 70s or 80s. And it was made up of short pile fibers with just a shock absorption pad underneath. And this was not ideal. It's caused a lot of injuries, mainly ligament injuries. So you're talking about like ACL, MCL, meniscus, hamstring, because your knees and your body is not meant to, run and turn on a material like this. Um, so then they improved it a little bit by using the same short pile fibers, but then switching from shock absorption pads to sand and tape yarn infill. So that's kind of like the tan stuff you see in that picture. And that also worked a little bit, but it was still not ideal. And the idea of these turf fields are to, replicate grass fields. So with the third generation, they used 40 to 60 millimeter grade grass blades, which are a lot, more realistic to grass. If you're playing a sport, if you're playing soccer on these fields, it feels a lot better than playing on a field like the second or first generation. They also switched to a sand and rubber infill, and that's where the ecologically friendly issue comes up. So looking at state of art, a lot has been done in general, looking at infill in general. So um, there's been studies looking at like the running, turning, accelerating, force reduction values of various infills, including cork. There's been studies you can see on the right here. There's been studies based on the chemical breakup or breakdown of a lot of these infills, and you can see in this picture there's a lot of bad stuff in tire chrome that you don't really want, in the environment. Um, a lot of that stuff is not present in cork infill. And then the issue, oh, and then there's been tests looking at the uh, the force reduction of cork and other infills over time. The issue with all of these is that they're all very individual and cover a very specific thing, and there isn't anything out there that covers all of them at once. So the idea of this study or this proposal is to look at all of these metrics that have been tested in the past and test them all together, looking at all three or all four metrics at the same time. So then looking at the strategy of doing that, um, the first the first test that will be done are mechanical property tests. So that includes shock absorption, coefficient of friction, force reduction, abrasiveness, torque, and so on. Um, and the way to test this is to use multiple variations of each thing you're testing. So if you're testing rubber pellets, you're testing cork pellets, you're testing nano pellet. There's a lot of different infill materials. You want to test it, dry and wet, mainly because if you have an outdoor field and it rains, you don't want the mechanical properties of whatever infill you're using to change a ton. So, you test them, you test each of them dry, each of them wet. And since rubber pellets are the currently used infill for Generation 3 turf, that's kind of the standard that you're looking at. So here you can kind of see there's a coefficient of friction test being done on an Instron machine. There's a torque test on the right, and then force reduction slash shock absorption test down at the bottom. The next thing you want to do is kind of the functional properties. So same idea of testing cork pellets, rubber pellets, wet and dry. But this time you're doing not I mean, there's still mechanical properties, but not exactly the same. Because in this way you're putting a sensor in a shoe and then running, turning, and accelerating on the turf with different infills to see how the force is reduced from the steps. So the idea here is to match the rubber infill values with the cork values to see if it's an acceptable replacement. The last thing you want to do is test all of those two previous things over time. So, um, you know, turf fields are not meant to last for a year. They're meant to last for 10 years, 20 years. Right. So you don't want to just test values of the Cork infill immediately after making it and then never again, because that'll only give you an idea of uh, how the curve will look and feel after, a day or two. So looking at how it'll like degrade over time is way more important. So we don't have the time to wait for 10 years testing this one thing. So a way to kind of simulate that is doing cyclical and fatigue testing, where you run the same test, the same tension, compression, coefficient of friction test a ton of times, thousands of times, to see how these measurements will either reduce or hopefully not significantly reduce over time. Then moving on, just to wrap things up, cork pellet infill can replace rubber infill to reduce the negative ecological effect that turf currently has. So the main issue here is that rubber pellets are not biodegradable, although functionally they've gotten a lot better over time. It hasn't changed the fact that they're not good for the environment. And although turf fields are only going to be used more in the future because they're uh, more economically friendly than natural grass fields are, unfortunately. Um, a way to reduce the ecological harm has to be found. So the idea is that cork infill can replace rubber infill to make it biodegradable and ecologically friendly. All right, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you can throw them in the canvas below. All right, have a good day.